It's a great pleasure to have you all join me today to discuss with our audience the prevention of SSA within the family, signs that they can watch out for in the family, and then if, unfortunately, there's a disclosure either by the person harmed or the one harming, what you can do. So we're quickly just going to run around the room, and I'd like everybody to introduce themselves very briefly to the audience. So Tanith, I'm going to start with you.
Hello, my name's Tanith. I'm a counsellor and a counselling supervisor. I'm also the director of SARC, which is the Sibling Sexual Abuse Resource Centre, and that provides education and support for parents. I'm also the Sibling Sexual Abuse Project Officer for SARSAT. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tanith. Jenny.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Coleman. I'm the director of Stop It Now in the United States. We run a confidential helpline, offer trainings, and provide prevention and healing materials to help families and individuals. Really happy to be here.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. And Georgia.
Hi, I'm Georgia Naldrett. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining in from on this virtual world. I'm calling in from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'm the Stop It Now Australia manager. So I work with individuals concerned about their own or someone else's sexual thoughts or behaviours towards children, including parents who are concerned about a child's sexualised behaviour. I previously worked the Stop It Now UK and Ireland team, and great to be joining you today.
Great to have you here, Georgia. Thank you. And Stuart.
Thanks, Nancy. My name's Stuart Allardyce. I'm one of the directors of the UK-based charity, the Lucy Faithful Foundation. We run the Stop It Now helpline in the UK, and my background is as a social worker, and I've been involved with working with families affected by sibling sexual abuse over the last 20 years or so.
What a great group we have to be able to discuss with the audience and share with the audience your expertise and understanding of this subject, because as you know, we've explored in this whole SiblingsToo Day event, is that the subject matter is or can be difficult to deal with and is difficult for parents to understand. So let's start right there, that, you know, we're talking about preventing something, but there is some confusion about what sibling sexual abuse actually is, and its prevalence and all that. So, you know, it's difficult and confusing for parents to try and prevent something that they don't fully understand or don't fully understand the ramifications of. So ideally in our conversation today, we're going to help parents with that. So I think we really need to start at the beginning, that, you know, children are sexually curious, and there is healthy behavior between children, and there's healthy behavior between siblings. But what exactly, Jenny, I'm going to toss you in on this one. What exactly does that mean? Sort of healthy sexual behavior, and, you know, children are sexual beings. So what does that look like to a parent of 10-year-olds?
Well, that's a great question to start with, because I do think it's hard for parents, adults, to think of children as sexual beings. And we talk about the cognitive development of children, the physical development of children, emotional development, but it's harder to talk about the sexual development of children. So we want to acknowledge that children are in their body. They feel sensations. They have responses to different stimuli. They're also being, you know, fed the stimuli of the world and reacting to that, media, peers, etc. And so we just want to acknowledge that we can't just say, hold off until you're 18. You know, we don't want you to have any sort of sexualized feelings or sexualized notions, because kids need to be in their full self and experience what's going on. But as adults, that's when we're able to step in and to really help keep safe environments with good, positive messages about boundaries and privacy and consent. So not to get ahead of ourselves, but just to acknowledge that we should expect that children are going to practice sexual behaviors as part of their normal learning the world.
But what would a normal sexual behavior look like, say, but generally speaking, between siblings? Okay, what would that look like?
Well, there's some of that just general kind of, I'm so sorry that the spin the bottle phrase is coming up. I'm having my own memory suddenly of being with siblings and with neighbors, and having our first game in a little fort of spin the bottle where, you know, I'll show you a part of my body if you show me a part of your body. So it's curiosity driven as well, right? And so that's a lot of what it is I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to learn about parts of the body. I'm trying to learn what I see the adults or the older kids doing. So it could be playing house or playing doctor and mimicking the roles that they're experiencing.
Okay, anybody else have any thoughts on that too?
I think it's kind of characterized by the kind of natural curiosity that young children have, trying to find out about the world around them and find out about their bodies and the bodies of other people, and trying to understand gender. And, you know, a lot of these things are there in what we see in what Jenny's described, you know, playing house and playing mummies and daddies and what have you. And that's absolutely normative, expected behavior. And then we see, you know, sibling sexual behavior kind of on a continuum, which we can talk about a little bit more in a second. But it's about trying to get to the qualities, I think, of what we see as in terms of normative expected sexual behavior for young children.
And so I know for some people, and I'm just going to play devil's advocate here because I do quite good at that. You know, so an older child who is actually being abusive couches something in the idea of we're playing doctor. So they actually use that phrase or that whatever you want to call it, but it's actually an abusive situation. So when we're looking at, again, that sort of normal behavior, I mean, in your experience, because you're working very closely with these families, so you know, are parents usually aware that the kids are even playing and playing games or having the natural curiosity? Are they even aware that that's going on, generally speaking, or, you know, that we're playing house and mummy and daddies and stuff like that?
Well, I think for me, I have seen it in my practice quite often. And when we talk about normative sexual behavior in children, it's usually children in and around the same or similar ages. And it is about exploration and curiosity. But when the parents are aware of it, it's an opportunity to educate children and explore that further. And quite often when it's normative, it usually stops. So it's not that power imbalance or age difference. And for me, as everyone says, it is curiosity. One sibling isn't harmed by it. It's quite often usually not.
There's giggling and sort of like, ooh, or something like that. Jenny?
Absolutely. I think we really look at the quality of the play, and that there are certain characteristics that we're looking like Tanith mentioned. So whether it's age or whether it's, you know, any other differences, cognitive differences, size differences. And what's really important from my side is, what if the kid's been told about consent and about certain behaviors, about privacy, playing with doors open or keeping clothes on? And what do the parents know about, and I told you I wanted to slip this in, Nancy, but about healthy sexual education and development for their kids. So the more that parents are aware of what to expect along a normative lens, then hopefully that helps them feel that they're able to better observe behaviors and know when something seems amiss, that it doesn't feel quite as much a mystery because they know our family rules, or we've talked about this, or we've given these instructions, but something's falling apart and it seems out of the norm with what's expected with this child's behavior. Then you can say, okay, now I need to look at this with different lens.
Yeah, and that we can jump straight in now to then the conversation about prevention, because that healthy sexual education, both with, you know, creating that environment within the family, that certain kinds of conversations, we can have those conversations, and the parents are open about things like consent or body safety and all that sort of stuff. So that is one of the key pieces of prevention, is creating the environment where children can discuss these things with their parents, and parents feel comfortable, although, well, comfortable is not always the right word when we're talking about sexual things, but you know, that environment of conversation, openness, and honesty is there. So from a preventative point of view, I mean, I would always encourage parents to even discuss it between themselves as parents, or say a single parent discussing it with a friend, sort of self-analyzing how open is my environment at home without being just willy-nilly all over the place. But, you know, how open are we in our conversations about these important matters? So I'm sure we can all agree on that. But what other things do we need to pay attention to as parents in looking to prevent not only sibling sexual abuse, but other types of harmful behavior or, you know, abusive, problematic behavior? What do we need to be thinking of in prevention in our minds?
Nancy, I think it's helpful to go back to what you were just saying in a little bit more detail, because it's easy to say, open up the communication, but what does that look like in reality? And one of the earliest steps is to start these conversations as young as possible, to use books. And we know that there's lots of books for children from a very young age about sexual education, about my body belongs to me, etc. So bringing that conversation into the house from a young age and adjusting that and developing that as they develop. So don't just do, we've had the conversation once and now we never need to talk about it again. It's very easy as a parent to go, well, this is uncomfortable. I don't want to talk to my children about sex. I don't want to talk about consent. But we need to be mirroring what we expect from children, and that's how we can keep them safe. So having that open communication and being the person that looks comfortable, even if inside you're screaming, going, this is so uncomfortable, taking that responsibility as the parent to open communication from as young as possible.
Right.
It's a good point, Georgia, because I think there's lots of misapprehensions about what we mean when we talk about sex education with younger children. And actually, it's not talking to young children about what sexual intercourse is or what sexual acts are. That's never been what professionals have done in the space. It's talking about what healthy relationships look like, healthy non-sexual relationships, which give then children an understanding of consent and trust and what they should do if anything concerns them or worries them in any way. But also it's talking about bodily autonomy and the child's rights to their own body, but also, you know, helping children, making sure that they have the right vocabulary and words for different parts of the anatomy. So, you know, if a child is 4, 5 or 6 years old, these are the kind of building blocks that we should all be kind of putting in place around not just child sexual abuse prevention, as you say, Nancy, but in fact, kind of prevention of all kinds of maltreatment.
Yes, it goes beyond, and I've said it in other parts of the day, that learning about these things as parents and implementing these things, and as you sort of say, George, it sort of, you might be screaming inside, but pushing these sort of conversations out and having this kind of environment is just generally great anyway, because it can impact in a positive way the family on so many different levels, even if this never occurs in the family, right? Or you know, it's a preventative step as well. But, you know, just opening those lines of communications is never a bad thing. When we look at other things regarding preventing sibling sexual abuse, I think there's some things that we never think might be contributing factors in the household, such as children sharing a bedroom. It happens quite a lot because of all sorts of different reasons. You know, perhaps it's a socioeconomic thing. Somebody can't afford a space where every child has their own bedroom and all that sort of stuff. But one of the things that came out in other conversations and even in research is we inadvertently perhaps give the older or oldest children a degree of authority over younger children when we're asking them to babysit, or can you take care of them while I run to the store, or something like that. So we're changing the dynamic in the family where there's now a hierarchy. In terms of preventing sibling sexual abuse, I believe that's a really important thing for parents to be mindful of, not necessarily hypervigilant, but mindful of. Are you favoriting a child? Are you putting a child in position of authority over other children? I mean, what have you seen in your professional practice about just that piece of parents inadvertently giving older children authority over younger children?
Well, one of the things that has come up, I think, is the language that we use when we tell the younger children listen to your older sibling, do what they say, they're in charge. And so we're giving a message that this older sibling can do what they want to. I know that that's not what parents are saying, but for younger ears, if we're not really, as Georgia said, kind of tearing apart that language a little bit more and being very specific about what the responsibilities are of that older sibling and making sure that all children involved know what those are, that can be really helpful. And staying away from that language that, Bobby's the boss of you. He can tell you what to do. That's going to be language that can set us up for some problems.
Right, for sure.
I think that's a very valid point, Jenny, because Nancy, what you said about giving older children caring responsibilities, we know this is opportunistic. So therefore, if we are leaving older children and not explaining the full extent, but again, that's not all cases. It's just if, for example, harmful sexual behavior is occurring, then there's more opportunity. But being specific in the language and saying, right, your sister's looking after you for whatever reason, and stating those boundaries, because quite often we hear, well, that's my brother, that's my sister. You told me they could do whatever they want, and so clear messaging is essential.
Do you think that the parents' ability to be clearer and more thoughtful and mindful of messaging also comes from having real responsibility in the attitude that they bring, that my children are not angels, my children are capable of misbehaving and creating problematic situations with their siblings? So, there's just this illusion of innocence that children are just going to be innocent all the time, and we don't even have to think about this sort of stuff. Do you think it becomes easier for parents if they accept the fact that maybe their children can create this problematic behavior? Does that make things easier, do you think?
For me, I think through education and awareness and recognizing that this could be a possibility. I hear too often parents saying, I never thought my child was capable. I never knew this existed. We educate in stranger danger, on consent, on cyber pornography, but no parent wants to believe that their child is actually capable of that. But that's also because the world's not talking about its existence and it's underrepresented. That's my opinion and what I see in my practice.
Georgia.
I think one of the key elements of that, Tanith, is the prevalence. It's so hard to think that your child could engage in this type of behavior, and it's always someone else's family, someone else's household. And it's about educating parents that actually the prevalence is much higher than we like to admit, and that it could be within your household, within your family unit. And that's not to create fear, it's just to open that communication up so we can put the things in place to prevent it from happening. I think we can all agree that we would like to prevent harm before it's caused. And so opening up this dialogue and thinking about these barriers that we can put in place is really helpful. And to be honest, there's no negative about having this approach to language. It actually just leads to a positive prevention outcome.
For sure. And Stuart? I think it's maybe worthwhile thinking about risk factors in all of this. And, going back to a point you were making, Nancy, we certainly don't want, families to feel hypervigilant and constantly kind of monitoring situations. But, the more responsibility that's placed on older siblings to look after younger siblings would be one of the risk factors, which you're talking about. Not to labor this too much, but I think, although the research is equivocal on this, certainly in my experience, sibling sexual abuse more commonly happens in step families, blended families, reconstituted families. That's not always the case. It can also be kind of siblings who are kind of biologically related, but sometimes kind of tensions that exist within kind of step sibling groups can particularly kind of feelings of resentment that perhaps an older sibling might have in relation to kind of younger siblings that they're not biologically related to, can then sometimes be acted out in various ways. So it's another thing to think about. as you mentioned earlier on, if you have older siblings that are sharing a room with younger siblings, I would certainly mention that as a potential risk factor. And the last thing in terms of risk factors, and this is an awkward and difficult one to talk about, but any family can be affected by sibling sexual abuse. But we also know that sibling sexual abuse can be more common in families that have experienced challenges in various ways. Whether those challenges have been kind of challenges in relation to parenting in the past, whether those challenges relate to sexual abuse that the children within the family might already have experienced from adults or other adolescents, or indeed sexual abuse that perhaps even a parent has experienced in some way, that there are a number of things that can also kind of create additional challenges. So it just things to kind of think about in terms of what level of vigilance that you need to bring to sibling relationships.
Georgia. Thank you, Stuart. Georgia.
I think another thing to add on that in terms of risk factors and warning signs, we keep mentioning the age gap, and a lot of, not all again, one of the warning signs can be a bigger age gap and often an older brother. So the majority, again, we don't know very much because it is under research, but the majority of sibling abuse is traditionally perpetrated by boys, with an older age gap to a younger sibling, which can be female or male. And it's just another thing to be aware of. Sibling abuse can happen in any environment and with any children, but if we're talking about risk factors, there are some factors to be aware of.
Absolutely. I think it, you know, if we're sitting back as parents and being honest with ourselves about, okay, I'm, you know, my relationship with my spouse is not very good. There's a lot of pressure and stress in the household. The children are quite agitated, or, you know, or there's a lot of stress. It's just little boxes that you can tick about, oh yeah, these things can increase the risk factor. All that being said, none of those things need to exist, and sibling sexual abuse can still occur. So, or you could have all of those things and it's not occurring because of something else that, you know, you've actually created, say, an environment where there's this really good communication and children understand respect and body autonomy and all that. So it's just things to be thinking about, being mindful of, because, you know, one of the key things that I hope comes out of this awareness day is getting the message across that this can happen in your family. And given the prevalence we currently know about in an underreported space, it's likely happened to somebody you know, if not in your own family, sort of thing. So it's that prevalent, it's that common. So one of the other things that we touched on is parents being, you know, and parents know this already, but being particularly vigilant about children's access to the internet because of the prevalence of pornography and the high degree of downloads from a Canadian company, I'm sad to say, but you know, related to brother-sister incest and sibling sexual abuse. Parents already know this, but again, it's so easy just to pass the, you know, the laptop or the iPad or whatever to the kids, and they're in their room and they're getting access to this pornography that is generally detrimental anyway, but particularly detrimental in terms of the relationship between siblings. I know of a couple of stories of, you know, as you say, Georgia, the older brother who's now accessed some pornography, being in some way curious and then essentially using the younger siblings to you know, enact what they found on the porn sites. So just to reiterate that being attentive to children's use of the internet is still a really important thing, and a preventative step in terms, for sure, in terms of sibling sexual abuse. And wherever possible, you know, I don't care personally how old my kids are. I'm going to put parental controls on any computer that's in my home. So it's like, I don't care how old they are. But yeah, anybody have a final comment on preventative steps? Because I really want us to look soon at, you know, what can parents look for in case it has happened in their home?
Nancy, I would just say, I'm sorry, Georgia, I didn't raise my finger. launching in.
Don't worry.
I know that we're really hammering in for good reason on the importance of education and conversation. And Stuart and Georgia, you may hear this as well, but that mother of a 9-year-old asking, oh, I thought that they were too young to talk to them about this. When do I start talking about, and they say sex ed, I was so appreciative, Stuart, of the point that you brought up that we're not talking about intercourse or advanced, mature sexual concepts. But too often parents are so worried about somehow creating a situation that exposes their children to sexual content, and that's what makes them more vulnerable. And so I just, really want to reiterate that providing children with information about their bodies and relationships and everything that we've said is not indeed increasing their risk, but instead is strengthening prevention in their health. So.
Good point. I think that's a very good point. And Georgia.
I think I was just going to add a little bit of a controversial point at times, but actually talking about pornography. I think when you mention pornography, everyone gets scared and they can imagine talking to their child about this. But we know children are accessing it younger and younger. And even with barriers up, they go to school and they see it from their peers. It's this hidden taboo that we don't talk about when we know a large majority of young people are accessing it. And so talking about what pornography is, what the risks are, where they can learn about sex in a healthy way. At the moment, we're working on a project with the University of Melbourne for young people who are worried about sex and pornography. It's called the WhatsApp program. Because the questions that are coming up from children and young people is, I saw something on pornography and I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to ask. And that's where the curiosity can sometimes come out in the behaviors as well. So being that parent that their kid can go up to and say, I actually watched this and I have a question.
Right.
And it should be happening in schools as well, which is another important conversation, I believe.
Good point. Stuart, you had something you wanted to add?
A UK study that came out 2 months ago took data from 1,000 young people aged 18 to 21 and asked them whether they had been exposed to pornography or had looked at pornography in childhood. The average age of seeing pornography for the first time in that particular study was 13. So if you're waiting to 14, 15, 16 to have that conversation about pornography, it is too late. And that conversation needs to be about, lots of young people do look at pornography to learn about things about sex, but also it's a really bad place to learn about sex. It's like trying to learn to drive by watching the Fast and Furious movies. It's not a good place to learn about consent and healthy relationships and what bodies look like and all those kinds. And there are loads of other places that young people can look at online, which actually kind of promote stuff around healthy sexuality. The last thing to say about this is it then connects to the stuff that we've been talking about, starting early, not starting having these conversations about particular kind of sexual things online, but having an interest as a parent, I say this as a parent myself, in what your children are doing online from an early stage. I agree with you about putting in stuff about parental restrictions and settings and so forth, but they become less and less effective when children get to 13, 14 or 15 because they can find their way around them. But actually just modeling that stuff about being interested in what your child is doing online from a really early stage. So by the time they get to 11 and 12, you can be having those conversations about what they're doing online because it doesn't come left field for them. Yeah,
everybody doesn't feel really awkward all of a sudden. So and just to follow on from something you said, Jenny, about the way that children are not necessarily, having the conversation isn't actually going to cause the child to go out and do something. I don't know about you, but there were times where I was having conversations with the kids when they were younger, and I was all worried about having the conversation, and it was going to be really awkward, and it was super awkward for me, and the conversation was over, and the kids going, "Is that it? Can I go now?" And they took it in, they heard it, they had their questions answered, and then they went off and did whatever. it had like no negative impact whatsoever. And there's me like, oh, I need a drink, you know, like it's more problematic and difficult, I think, for parents to have these conversations than, of course, it is for the child to hear them, particularly if we're starting these conversations very young and using proper terminology to explain anatomy. I think, you know, you can start the conversation when they're asking about their little brother or sister on the change table and when they're changing diapers, or so you can, you know, when the kid's going, what's that, or whatever, or why is that different than me, if it happens to be, that you can have an age appropriate conversation right then and there. So let's now move on to the conversation about things for parents to keep in mind, and signs to watch out for, just in case, all prevention aside, these things can still happen. So what can parents be looking for, watching for, in terms of the behaviors or the mindset of their children that sibling sexual abuse may be occurring somewhere, or problematic harmful sexual behavior that is not yet quote unquote abusive, but is harming. It's a negative experience for one or both children or whatever. What can parents be looking for?
Depending on the age and stage of development of the child, it's very difficult to generalize some of the signs and symptoms. Again, going back to age appropriateness, during the time of occurrence, if there is harmful or problematic sexual behavior, the child who is experiencing it, not the one who is harming, may not necessarily know that it is wrong or damaging until they're older in life. But some of the subtle signs or changes in behaviors, maybe more clingy to the parent, not wanting to leave, refusing to go to school, and maybe a change in the relationship with the sibling. And that can be both, I suppose, both extremes, maybe wanting to avoid the sibling or wanting to be around that sibling more. Sometimes we don't see that as an indication. We look and think, oh, isn't that great? They're having a great relationship, but that child doesn't understand. Again, UTIs, bruising, complaining of stomach upsets. It's very hard to generalize. And this is where I think we need education from children from 2 to 5 years of age and 6 to 9, because as they grow and develop, the symptoms are going to be different. But I will let other people, I suppose, comment on other different signs.
Stuart, Jenny?
I mean, I would just quickly say that, I mean, you've already mentioned some kind of physical signs like, you know, UTIs and you know, perhaps kind of gentle bruising and things like that. These things, although they do happen in cases around sibling sexual abuse, are relatively unusual. Because that kind of physical evidence is there, but it's usually more, as you say, the stuff on kind of psychological signs. And the difficulty here, is it a difficulty? The difficulty here is that the signs and indicators tend to be the signs and indicators of stress. You know, whether it's your child becoming withdrawn, whether it's your child becoming angry or distressed. Also worthwhile mentioning kind of sexual awareness beyond a child's years. That might be a kind of, you know, more tangible kind of thing that we could kind of pay attention to. But most of the signs and indicators are the signs of stress and may have other explanations as well. But just kind of, you know, bearing in mind that signs of a child being stressed could be signs and indicators of something like this happening, but just to kind of keep that there at the kind of back of your head.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Is again, raising awareness to parents that it might be stress, but it also might be stress caused by something else, rather than just being in denial that this could ever occur anyway. Jenny, you were going to make a point?
I absolutely agree about signs in children can be very confusing, and we still respond. So that's getting on. So regardless if we don't know what's causing the sign of distress, we still want to respond. But I wanted to say also, looking at the child who's causing the harm, that we also are looking at the nature of their relationships with other children and with their sibling and within the house. Whether it's a child who's got a lot of control or seems to really want things in their way or seems to have a lot of control over their younger siblings. These would be things that I would just want to pursue and just understand more the relationship and talk about, equal time in the family, or how do we ask each other to play in a way that's not ordering them around, and taking those opportunities to demonstrate just that kind of engagement with other peers. But I think sometimes we may notice more the signs in the child who is causing the harm than the child who is experiencing the harm.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Tanith.
That's actually a very, very valid point, because I've had a parent say to me that I didn't even notice, for the simple fact that the older brother was playing much more with the children and tickling, and there was a lot of laughter, and it was all done in front of the parents, but that was seen as a loving, healthy sibling relationship. And it was only through time then disclosure showed. But that was a change in behaviour for the child who had harmed. But the parents seen that as a thoughtful thing and didn't think to look further into it. And then for other examples, a child who is harmed having difficulty and being more withdrawn around school and that type of thing. Again, it's about looking and educating and unpacking, okay, is there more going on? Because we know the peer pressure of children nowadays, and to be as sexually advanced as some of their other peers. And I hear it being reported again that the child who is harmed thought their sibling was a safe person. They didn't want to reject or be rejected. And quite often they have experimented to go to peers. And again, that's a generalization. I'm not saying quite often, I didn't mean it like that. But again, we don't know. So it's about finding out and looking at the behaviors of somebody who has caused harm.
And it sort of goes back to what you were saying, Stuart, about being, without being hypervigilant, being interested in your child so that you're noticing the changes potentially in either the person who was harmed or the one who's doing the harming, and paying attention and being open to the idea that something might be going on. It might not be sibling sexual abuse, but something might be going on. Even if it is, say, adolescent stress, it's important for a parent to deal with that, just as, and as it is any other thing that could be causing the changes in behavior. It's that attitude of being interested in my children. At the same time, I'm a parent, I'm a step parent. I recognize that it's very difficult for parents to, particularly single parents, for example, to juggle all of this all of the time. But I think it would be fair to say, and this is just a number off the top of my head, if we spent 15 minutes more a day being interested in our kids, that would have a positive impact all around. If 30 minutes, 15 minutes, even a period of time, even increasing that sense of curiosity and being interested in the kids, just a little bit, as much as we possibly could, rather than making the assumption that there's nothing that could be going wrong, because our kids are innocent and they're angels and they're not capable of hurting each other. Sibling abuse, without the sexual side of it, we know sibling abuse has a really high statistic in families of, again, all socioeconomic classes and all the rest of it. So forms of bullying that, for example, would not be allowed in schools is going on in families, but then we articulate it as, oh, that's just like natural antler tangling, and in actual fact, no, it's not. So it's just about raising that awareness, educating oneself as a parent, learning more about this subject matter and taking that knowledge back into the home, and then endeavoring to apply it in the specific nature of that home. Because you're very right, Tanith, and we've said it before, it's difficult to generalize in this conversation, but this section is all about trying to do that to encourage parents to learn more. So there might be some changes in behavior. There might be some changes in the physical responses between children. And I don't want to be left alone with this person anymore. I cling more to the parents, or the opposite, but all of this may not show outwardly. So you might not actually see anything at all. As you say, Tanith, maybe the child who's being harmed doesn't know that they're being harmed yet. And I just go back to being more interested or being highly interested and curious about your children and mindful of the changes in behavior in the context that maybe bad things are happening or really negative things are happening between the siblings. So let's pretend now, you know, we've got to have that conversation as general as we can. And I know it's a very specific conversation, but either the person who has harmed or the one who was harmed discloses, says something to you that makes your sixth sense go, uh-oh, either. So they say something that's like setting off your sixth sense, or they're directly saying something. I'm being touched or I'm being harmed in a certain way. Now, what do you do as a parent? What do you do and what do you not do? Let's go there too. So Georgia, I'm going to ask you to weigh in first on this conversation. What do parents do and not do in any form of either sixth sense disclosure, that's a hard one to say, or direct disclosure?
I think the role that parents can play here is so important, and we know that initial reaction from a parent can have quite a long-term impact in both a positive or potentially negative way. And so it's a really good opportunity to, you know, use what we learn from days like today and put it into action if it ever was to come up. One of the most important things is to believe a child. We know that there's a common misconception that children lie about abuse, and that's not true. If a child discloses abuse, they are telling the truth. And it's really important for us to bear that in mind and approach the conversation in that way. Don't dismiss it, don't deny it, as much as it might feel natural, because we're talking about your other child in this conversation. It's really important to believe the child, react in a very calm manner, while also not minimizing the impact of the behavior. And this goes for disclosures both from the child who has engaged in the behavior or who has been harmed, remembering to be non-judgmental and supportive in that moment. It's not easy, and it's really important that parents also access support for themselves outside of that conversation, but taking on that role in that moment to be calm, supportive, and offer the care for the child that they need in that moment and moving forwards.
Great, thank you. Stuart?
I think George has kind of covered most of it, but I mean, just to say, your point about the kind of sixth sense disclosures are a very good one. I think when I think about children who've made disclosures to me in professional contexts, it's usually not a child who you already know coming out immediately with a disclosure, but rather a child often testing the water in terms of the conversation and seeing what your reaction is and waiting for you to ask some kind of supplementary questions. So it might be, you know, a child who's talking about their relationship with their sibling and how the relationship's not going well, and maybe there are things that sometimes make them feel quite upset, and they're asking really for the adults to really ask some more questions and put some meat on the bone about what's being talked about here. So I think that the idea of kind of sixth sense kind of conversations is absolutely right. The thing Georgia was saying about remaining calm, I think, is incredibly important. I think although it can be devastating for parents to hear something like this, let's be absolutely frank about this, but what the child is looking for is a level of containment for you to be an adult here, and to try and kind of hold reality together. And I think it's important to give positive reinforcement to say, you know, I'm so glad that you're able to kind of share this with me, and it's really important to give a message that actually your absolute priority, my absolute priority now, is your safety. And we need to do everything we possibly can to make sure that you're safe now and this doesn't happen again. And then what Georgia was saying about, which you know, I think, you know, parents, even if the behavior is not necessarily abusive but more kind of inappropriate and problematic, I think it's really important for parents to get support, and that might be, going to social work or kind of professional supports. If they feel that they're not able to do that for whatever reason, then, you know, using an anonymous helpline or indeed just turning to other people that they have in their life that might be able to support them in some way.
Thank you. Jenny.
So much, Dad. Everything that's been said is right on. But I also want to acknowledge that as much as we want parents to stay calm, we often hear on our helpline after they've already responded and they said, I think I blew it. And so I think it's just really important to acknowledge that parents are people. And when they hear that their children that they love, that this has happened, their first response may be, you know, whatever, anger, grief, and it's coming back, because I absolutely agree with Georgia that the response often sets the tone for healing and recovery, but it doesn't mean that we can't come back to our children and say, you know, that was really important what you told me. I believe you. I'm so proud of you for sharing this. I'm really sorry that you've been scared or hurt. And I'm really sorry I got upset, but when I think you're hurt, sometimes I don't always control my emotions, and mommy, daddy's working on that too. So I think it's just, again, the way that we use our words is so important, and parents have that thin line of both wanting to protect children from bigger, mature, you know, traumatic experiences, but being honest and authentic is so powerful and can be so conducive to a healing process. And I also just, again, want to emphasize how I think critical it is for parents to get support, because we used to, it hasn't run for a long time, but it's stopping now in the US. We used to have a newsletter called When You Love Them Both, because there is just such a, you know, mixture of intense emotions of the person you described. I love my son and I'm hating him. And helping parents negotiate through that is really important so they can show up through for both children. And then my final thing is, I do think it's really important to reiterate to the child too, it's the adult's job to have kept you safe. And something happened that didn't happen, and now it's our job to make sure you're not hurt anymore, and that everybody gets the help they need so nobody is hurt again.
Including the person who caused the harm and the other siblings as well, right?
Yeah.
And the parents really are responsible for that. So this, I think, is a good time to sort of that makes common sense. It's common sense for me to get support, but what parents usually do is they go to their friends and look for their support there, because there's this concern that if I approach any professional organization or service sector or anything like that, my children are going to be taken away from me, or something's going to happen. The family's going to be split in some way. So I think it's really important to remind parents that there is a process in place in most jurisdictions for what happens next. The process isn't 100% all the time, but there is a process there, and it's getting sort of better and better all the time, particularly as we have events like this. We have more conversations, there's more training available, there's more understanding in society and the community. But support from your friends and other family members is great, but you really need professional support to maneuver this situation. So it really is, you know, whether it's legally mandatory in the jurisdiction or not, it is essentially, you must go and seek professional support from organizations and individuals who know what they're doing. Otherwise, you know, because I mean, I've seen adults say to each other, oh no, it's nothing to worry about. Don't worry about it. It'll be fine. And I've read many stories in the portal on my website where I'm collecting stories of, you know, oh, my parents spoke to my brother or my harming sister or whatever it was, and they promised it would never happen again, and it didn't. But that doesn't take away from the fact that, you know, I got no support. It was just, you know, there was this conversation, that was the end of it. So there is paths that professionals can put parents on to walk them through this whole thing. And I think it's really important that we remind parents of that. I mean, you guys all work in those pathways. You have those for want of a better phrase, sort of roadmaps and all the experience that you bring to the fore for that family that's walking through the door. So a family walks through the door, generally speaking, because I know it's very specific, but generally speaking, what happens next? What could a parent reaching out to an organization or a professional system expect? Stuart?
Well, I mean, as you said, it's very specific to kind of what jurisdiction you're
Yeah.
in. But
Yeah.
I mean, certainly when I meet with families who have been affected by this kind of issue, and when I speak to parents, some of the first things I try and get across are that, you know, finding out that your child has sexually abused another child within your own family is, of course, an unbelievably upsetting thing for most parents to find out about. But it's also something that is relatively commonplace in society. It happens a lot more than we generally assume as members of the public. We know that about a third of sexual abuse is actually caused or perpetrated by children and young people themselves. So it's quite commonplace. What we also know from quite a lot of evidence now is the vast majority of children and young people who display these kind of behaviors do not persist with those behaviors into adulthood. So if one of the questions you're asking is, does this mean that my child will be an adult sex offender? Never say never, but the general answer to that is no. This is usually something quite developmentally and contextually specific for the vast majority of young people in all of this. And the last thing that I try and get across is that, and although the chances of this happening as your child moves into adulthood are very low, we have programs in place that can make a real difference for all children affected by this, those who cause the harm and those who have experienced the harm, to make sure that risks are reduced both within the context of your family, but also risks are reduced with respect to the child who's caused the harm, causing this harm to anyone else out with the family as well.
Right. Thank you, Stuart. Georgia, do you have any thoughts on this?
Just to add that it can seem very daunting to talk about it for the first time. And the next steps can seem, you know, where do I go next? It's such a big question. But you don't have to make these decisions on your own. And we're here to support what those next steps can be. Part of the benefit of Stop It Now is an anonymous helpline can feel much easier as a starting step. And so it's the first step to pick up the phone, talk about it, and we can explore in those calls what services exist, where you can go to next. We know that support for both the child displaying the harmful behavior as well as experiencing it, therapeutic support has a positive effect on the long-term recovery, on their healing, on their likelihood to engage in further harmful behavior. So although it might seem daunting, it's helpful to explore. And starting those conversations with a professional is always a great first step.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard stories of parents who, as you say, you know, it's very daunting and is overwhelming and extremely emotional as they sort of step into a system that has to come around them to support them and the whole family, because it's a whole family approach, you know, really for the longer term positive impact of any sort of intervention. It's a whole family approach, and parents feeling overwhelmed, and then sort of, you know, a few months down the line or a year into the program or whatever, parents are talking about how overwhelmingly proud they are of all their kids, of how the whole family has come together, particularly if it was once, you know, dysfunctional or fractured in some way, by needing to intentionally and purposefully seek support and therapy and whatever other supports need to come into place. The little fractures were all fixed too, or were in the path of being fixed too. So what may be extremely daunting and overwhelming right now, when you step into a support system, can be very comforting and therapeutic over the longer term. So today it might be really freakishly overwhelming, and then in a very short period of time it becomes much better. This is like the worst day, sort of thing, and it'll get better. Tanith, you had a comment?
Yeah, I tend to agree with what everyone is saying. At the moment of disclosure, a whole family's world is thrown apart, especially parents and the primary carers. That's why it's so essential that the parents receive the support. Sometimes as parents, as long as my children are okay, I'll be okay. And you forget about your own needs. And when I'm working with people in this crisis, quite often parents are experiencing secondary PTSD, different things. So it's important that everyone in the family receives support. And family therapy is great, but sometimes you need that individual process as well to work through your own grief, the loss of the childhood, your expectations for your children. The conflict between the different needs can be hugely overwhelming, and that takes time to work through. So everyone getting support, as you said, Nancy, can heal the different fractures within a wider context. And as parents, you can be the biggest support for your children, both the child who is harmed, but also the child who has been harmed. And that belief and that containment and your own self-care is imperative, because how can you hold everyone if a parent may be crumbling themselves? And that's where the system, social services, are all well-intentioned. You know, parents that are maybe minimizing this out of fear of the children being taken away. Social services have the same belief as what you as a parent have in keeping the family together, but how can they best support and assist? And that's why I love the Stop It Now, the confidential helplines. During crisis, parents don't know where to turn or the information to receive. So even knowing that's out there can really minimize the long-term impacts. And one thing I would say to parents is it's about being responsive rather than reactive. And it's short-term pain for a long-term gain.
And I think the other message too is also, it's not a reflection of you as a parent. If this is occurring in the family, it's not a reflection of you. So it's okay if we move you out of the way in terms of, you know, you are not the cause of this necessarily. And so let's take that out of the conversation. And sometimes in order to separate an event, whatever it is that is significant, that's why a parent needs the support, is they need to pull themselves away from that so that they can look at it from a different viewpoint. And Georgia, I think you had a comment, and Jenny, you did as well. So Georgia?
I just wanted to really emphasize what Tanith is saying. The experience that we have from parents is that they go into this, you know, superhero mode sometimes, and they try and fix all the pieces and are doing a great job at being a parent. And then you stop and ask them, how are you doing? And there's instantly this moment where you can almost hear it, that they haven't stopped to think about how they're doing. And it's difficult. And it's really important to have those moments where you stop and go, how am I? Like, this is like a grenade. My whole life has, you know, completely changed in one moment. And taking time to look after yourself is so important. And so I just wanted to emphasize that even more.
Great, thank you. And Jenny?
I agree with everything that's being said. And I don't mean to complicate this even further, but it is really important that I feel that I often also need to acknowledge that I'm looking at white faces as we're talking about the experience of reaching out for support and systems being available. And we know that that's not necessarily the experience of a lot of other people, particularly our BIPOC community. That doesn't mean we don't want support. And this is a broken system in that way. And we understand that. And it's not safe then for parents of color to maybe ask for help. And I don't have an answer. I wish I did, as we all do. But I wanted to call it out because I think that that's one of the first steps, is to say the systems that are available may not be able to provide my family with the type of support that we need, but that doesn't mean that we don't continue to first try to fix the system, as well as make sure that there's other types of support available and that we're encouraging that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also, you know, one of the hopeful outcomes of events like today is, you know, increasing the awareness of sibling sexual abuse and its impacts on a whole family and a community and everything, as we've seen in other areas that we didn't talk about 20 or 30 years ago that we're now talking about, such as sexual abuse in the church, in sports teams and stuff. The political will to say add funding, change some legislation, increase the likelihood that more supports are coming. That to me is one of the hopeful sort of outcomes of events like today and the continued work that everybody is doing. I do believe that the time has come for the conversation of sibling sexual abuse not to go back into the genie's bottle. I think we've reached that point now, because there seems to be this real groundswell, this bottom-up kind of movement, particularly driven by adult survivors and people who want to speak out, whereas before we weren't speaking out, and now we are. It's very difficult to shut us up. So, you know, keeping the conversation going. I totally agree with you, Jenny. There are systems that need to be fixed, and particularly at the multicultural, multidimensional level in terms of support. So, you know, hopefully, with continued conversation and society's willingness to have this conversation. We don't want to normalize the behavior, but we do want to normalize the conversation. And it's from that I think we can create the changes that we know we need to be occurring in the systems, for sure. And including providing education to parents. And you know, right back to square one of this conversation is about supporting parents in their parenting skills and helping them to understand the risks and the opportunities that are in the midst of their families. So as we wrap up our conversation, I want to just quickly go around the room and see if there's a comment, a story, or something that you want to share with the audience that helps them walk away from this particular conversation feeling hopeful and encouraged and invited to learn more. So, Tanith, I'll start with you.
Well, I suppose for me, the common theme I see in parents is the shame. My message would be, don't let that shame bind you. You have the opportunity to intervene now, and that's where you have the power. Although disclosure is like a bomb, you have the ability to intervene and help your children heal and move forward. And I see that time and time again.
Thank you, Tanith. That's a great message. Jenny?
Oh, so many, Nancy. I think I'll land on that no child, or an adult for that matter, generally wants to be someone who hurts other people. I was just reflecting on our newer program, What's Okay for Youth, and that we're hearing from adolescents saying, I've asked my parents for help because I think I'm interested in weird things sexually, and hearing from parents, you'll grow out of it, or even therapists that they're already working with. And so I think that's, you know, I think my biggest message is that kids want help. They want us to help them with boundaries and conversations and to be safe and happy, fulfilled folks in their life. So we can show up for them.
We can. Thank you for that, Jenny. Georgia?
I think it's, you know, like any form of child sexual abuse, sibling sexual abuse is preventable and not inevitable. And we can all work together to prevent children from being harmed. And you're not alone on this journey. And even by showing up and listening to this event, you've taken the next step to help in the prevention. And I hope you keep that enthusiasm and continue to want to learn and know that there's support out there for you.
Thank you, Georgia. And Stuart?
The first family I worked with that had been affected by sibling sexual abuse, I worked with more than 20 years ago now, and it was a adolescent boy that had sexually abused his quite young sister over quite an extended period of time. And I remember the mum saying to me, it was like a grenade going off in her family when she found out what her son had done. And I think that is such a kind of common kind of experience for parents, that when this happens, it is experienced as a huge crisis for the family, one of the most desperate crises that families can work through. But it's also worth saying that I've worked with many families who, through real dedicated work themselves, have managed to kind of process this and work through what's happened. And families often then talk about, actually, what's happened was a window of opportunity for us to resolve other things within the family and the things that contributed to the abuse happening in the first place. And really just to encourage any family who's affected by this to take up that opportunity of support, even if it is anonymous support from a helpline or what have you. I think when families don't do that, then those fault lines don't get resolved. And what you sometimes then have is, siblings in adulthood who don't experience the family as an emotionally safe space, siblings that don't keep contact with each other, but also siblings who, when you have things like a family event, like a wedding or a funeral, and you suddenly have all these kind of issues about who can attend and who can't attend, and it's just it never goes away as an issue unless it is addressed. But actually, for those families that are able to address it, I think actually there are often really positive outcomes in all of this. So just to reinforce that message of hope in all of this, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And I just want to remind the audience as well that the resource pack that you're able to download along with watching all the videos and everything has a lot more information about the subject. And some of that information is of course from Stop It Now and from Tanith. So I do sort of refer people back to that. Today's event is about providing information and guidance and encouragement to carry on with the learning. This is not a sort of a one and done kind of thing. You can't just sit and listen to this video and think, oh, I'm fully equipped now. That's not the way it works. But there is information out there, and the resource pack has more information, URLs and guidance. So I would encourage people to go to that. I want to thank you all for coming today and for sharing your experience and your expertise. I think this is an extremely important part of today's event. All of it is, but this is really important because it's what parents are particularly curious about is, what can I do to, now that I know about this thing, now that I understand that this may happen in my family, what can I do to prevent it? And how do I manage it if it does in fact occur? So this is a really important topic, and I appreciate all of you today coming and sharing your guidance and your experience. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.